minute, Jack. This is a friendly celebration.
I don't much like the way you celebrate.
Have been getting some heat the last couple days over these Epstein files. A lot of people very angry with Pam Bondi, with FBI Director Kash Patel, with Assistant Director Dan Bongino. And I think what's really happening here is people had raised expectations, in part contributed to by Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Dan Bongino. And those expectations have been trashed. Specifically, we've all been led to believe in a thing that's been called kind of generically the Epstein files. Jeffrey Epstein, private island, private jet, flew lots of wealthy, famous, politically connected people to his island. And at that island, we are told to believe, and Ghislaine Maxwell, an associate of Jeffrey Epstein, has been convicted and is currently serving a lengthy federal prison sentence for trafficking underage girls to this island for the obvious purposes.
Tesla's stock is crashing. The headlines say Elon's empire is collapsing. But what if they're all dead wrong?
And we've all been led to believe that there's this thing called the Epstein files, with a list of all the names of all the people who were engaged in this monstrous activity with these underage girls. And if only the Epstein files, this thing, this list of names of people obviously engaged in criminal conduct, were released, people could be held accountable for what are patently horrific crimes. The trouble is, when we just call something an Epstein file, we don't know that that's what the Epstein file actually is. We don't know that it's a list of guilty people because none of us have seen it. In fact, Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Dan Bongino hadn't really seen the Epstein file until very recently, because what we call the Epstein file is literally thousands of documents, thousands of them. It's not just a concise list of 100 or 200 people who've been engaged in criminal conduct. It's a ton of stuff. And when Kash Patel was not the FBI director 18 months ago, he was on a podcast wearing a T-shirt, just casual, speculating about what the Epstein files might contain and why they haven't been released. And I think these were all reasonable speculations. And he was making, I think, reasonable inferences that maybe they're being hidden because they do expose wealthy, connected, powerful people for having committed an egregious criminal conduct. And he wanted those things exposed, reasonably enough. Dan Bongino, before he was in the FBI, when he was running his podcast, made similar statements. Importantly, when both these men were making these statements, they were not head of the FBI or assistant director in the FBI. They did not have actual access to these files. They didn't know what were in them. They were speculating about what was in them. Pam Bondi, famously, we're seeing clips of interviews with her on TV where she's asked about the Epstein files. And she says, they're on my desk right now for my review. And people are interpreting that to necessarily mean I have a list on my desk of 100 or 200 names of people who've indisputably committed horrific crimes against young women. But that's not actually what she said. We have to be very careful to avoid confirmation bias, to only hear or interpret the words presented to us in the way we want to hear them or interpret them. When Pam Bondi says, the files are on my desk for my review, that means she has not reviewed them yet. They're on her desk for her review. So when she's making that statement, she doesn't know what those files are or what they contain. She couldn't possibly until she has reviewed them. Now, it's quite possible that all these horrific things were done to these young women by famous, connected, wealthy people. And there was evidence of that in Epstein's paperwork. That can be true, and it can also be true that the documents and files available to Pam Bondi, Kash Patel, and Dan Bongino contain none of that incriminating evidence. We have to remember that the President Joe Otto Penn Biden administration had possession and control of all of Epstein's files for years. The only thing we can know for sure is that nobody in Trump's administration, much less Trump himself, is identifiable in those documents as having engaged in any of this horrific conduct, or that information would have been leaked by the Bidens and the progressives years ago. They're not going to hide that from the public, the left. So the only thing we can be certain of is that whatever information is in those files, none of it ever implicated Trump or his cabinet or anyone associated with him in this criminal conduct. Now, we know Trump's in the files. Lots of people are in the files. Lots of people flew on Epstein's private jet to his private island. But folks, that's not a crime. That's simply not a criminal offense for which you can prosecute somebody. Is it circumstantial evidence that might warrant an investigation? Sure. Warrant subpoenaing these files? Sure. But once you look at the documents, unless you can find actual evidence of criminal conduct, there's nothing to prosecute. And it's quite possible that the files at some time in the past contained that information. That could be true. And it can also be true that the files currently available to Bondi, Patel, and Bongino simply don't contain that information. Either it was never there or it was there and it was wiped out of those files. Certainly, if there was anything in those files that would have been harmful to the progressive left, you don't think they would have stripped it out in the years they had possession and control of those files? So when Carolyn Levitt says Trump's put together the best cabinet in American history, I think arguably that's true. Certainly in my lifetime, that's true. Certainly, I think we can all agree, vastly better than the cabinet in Trump's first term. And I don't think that's undermined by a lot of these emotional hot takes over the Epstein files. Everyone seems to be assuming, what are we assuming, actually? Are we assuming that Trump and Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have looked at those files, have identified people who could be prosecuted and convicted for having committed these offenses against these young women, and Trump, Bondi, Patel, and Bongino are covering it up? If you believe that, why are you supporting them? Why have you ever supported them?
Do not buy new windows if you live in Florida. Americans living in zip codes starting with 32, 33, and 34.
And who would they be covering it up for? Not themselves. We know they can't have been named in the files, or the Democrats would have released it. So now we're supposed to believe that Trump, Bondi, Patel, and Bongino are covering up evidence of guilt on the part of the Democrats? Does that make sense? And the reason the files aren't being released is because the Department of Justice has never done that. If they collect evidence and it's a list of people's names and there's no evidence those people committed a crime, they don't release that information. Why? So people's lives can be destroyed by innuendo? They never do that. That's just not a thing. You wouldn't want that. You wouldn't want that for anybody you cared about. You wouldn't want it for yourself. So they have to look at these files. They have to find some independent evidence of criminal misconduct. That's what's required to prosecute. And it's quite possible they just don't see that. I did a little blog post on this, but I think I've covered it here. So I was responding here to Viva Freis. Viva Freis does a great podcast. I think he's mostly on Rumble. If you don't follow him, you definitely should. He does great work. But of course, and Viva's a lawyer, originally from Canada. I believe he's still a Canadian citizen, currently living in Florida. Again, I'm a fan of Viva's work, so you should definitely check it out. But of course, that doesn't mean I can't disagree from time to time. And I have Viva had put up a long post about all this stuff, and I responded to it earlier this morning. Now, what you see here in quotes is Viva's stuff, and then you'll see my response without the quote. So Viva had written, barely 18 months ago, Kash Patel, and he's critical. Viva's being critical of Bondi and Patel and Bongino about this Epstein stuff. Viva writes, barely 18 months ago, Kash Patel said there was a list. Bill Gates is on it, that he was lobbying the government to not disclose the list that Bill Gates was, and that Republicans were feckless for having a majority and doing nothing. And my response to this is, well, sure, I saw that interview by Kash Patel. again, he's in a t-shirt on a podcast. When he did that interview, Patel was not director of the FBI. He did not have access to the list, whatever that's supposed to mean. A list of what? A list of passengers on a plane, absent evidence of any criminal misconduct? That's different than an Epstein list of pedos. He did not have access to the list. He was speaking, Patel was, explicitly speculatively. He was saying, are we supposed to believe this, or are we supposed to believe that, or can't you imagine that this might be the reason this is happening? And that's all fine. We're all allowed to speculate. We're all allowed to try to make inferences from the evidence available to us. But speculation and inferences are not evidence. And none of those statements in that interview were presented by Patel as, I know for certain that this or that or the other thing. None of them were based on what he claimed to be personal knowledge. He wasn't making those claims.
If you're someone who cares about healthy eating and increasing the protein in your diet, listen up, because we've got the ultimate protein hack.
Viva writes, throughout his career as a commentator and analyst, Dan Bongino implored his audience to never give up on the Epstein story, that there's something much deeper in there, that it involves intelligence, Middle Eastern countries. And my response is, well, that's similar to the Patel. Bongino, he was not in the FBI. He had no personal access to these documents. He was speaking as a podcast commentator, as an analyst, not as someone with personal knowledge. He may even have been right. Everything he's saying could be right. Everyone might be right. Viva might be right. That there's a huge cover-up that was happening. But in July 2025, when Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have to make a decision about whether or not they have the evidence required to prosecute someone, they either have that evidence or they don't. Or you believe they're lying about it. But what they need is actual evidence of criminal conduct. Speculation and innuendo and inference won't do it. It's quite possible that the evidence was obliterated before those three people assumed the reins of power and had access to these files. In which case, no matter what actually happened, and the worst could have happened, the deeds, the cover-up, all of that, the blackmail, all of that could have happened. All of that could have been real. But unless Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have evidence of that now, there's no prosecution to pursue. Viva writes, now, after assurances that the file was on her desk, which she said, and promising disclosures, which she meant of criminal conduct, we're being told that Epstein killed himself, that there is no client list, no blackmail material, and that we should just move on with our lives. Well, that could all be true. Meaning that in the files Pam Bondi and Kash Patel and Dan Bongino have on their desks, those files don't contain any of this. That's not an impossibility. The file was on Pam Bondi's desk. But what does the file even mean? Pam Bondi didn't know. She explicitly said the file was on her desk for her review. Until that review, she couldn't know with certainty what the file contained. Nobody could. Now we're hearing that the file on her desk was voluminous, thousands of documents, but it didn't contain, the file on her desk, Pam Bondi's desk, didn't contain evidence of criminal conduct. That there's no evidence that the names contained in those documents were engaged in criminal activity. And in that case, the Department of Justice procedure has always been you don't release the names of people for whom there's no evidence of misconduct. Viva writes, after Kash specifically described the criminality of the previous FBI DOJ administration, they are basing their findings on the file provided by the criminal administration. And I'm sensitive to this argument. You're saying the Biden administration was corrupt, so how can you trust the files you get from them? The answer is you can't. You can't. The Biden administration was corrupt. Any documents you get from them must be presumed to be similarly corrupt. But that's not the right question. It's not the right legal question. The right legal question is, do you have in hand evidence of criminal misconduct. If you don't, you cannot prosecute. Even if the misconduct actually occurred. Viva writes, this is an abject disaster that's severely undermining the Trump administration and the most integral populist players in it, namely the director and deputy director of the FBI. That's not my take on this at all. Anyone who believes that Epstein had a client list of criminal monsters must now also believe that the evidence of this list was either obliterated or stolen or hidden by the previous administration, which would be an undermining of the previous administration. Trump didn't do that. Or you have to believe that Trump is currently engaged in a massive conspiracy to cover up for Democrat monsters who committed horrific crimes against children. Does someone believe that? If you believe that, how can you support Trump? Or I would suggest it's possible that Trump is telling us the truth. They had good reason to expect that a careful review of the Epstein files in the possession of the prior administration would lead to evidence of criminal conduct that could be prosecuted. They believed that. But that the actual review of what is actually available to them does not amount to evidence of prosecutable criminal conduct. That could be true. It could be because the criminal conduct that occurred was more limited than we thought, or it could be that it was largely Epstein who was engaged in this criminal conduct. And of course, he's beyond our reach at this point. Or it could be the criminal conduct was exactly as expansive as we all suspected it to be, but the evidence has been destroyed. None of which makes Pam Bondi or Kash Patel or Dan Bongino a liar or undermines their credibility, in my view. And again, I hate covering topics like this because I know that 90% of you have made an absolute emotional commitment on this question. And it's not possible for me or anybody else to reason someone out of a position they didn't reason themselves into in the first place. So for about 10% of you, you're like, oh, these are facts. Maybe these facts, maybe this narrative of what could have happened, that's not a hysterically neurotic take on all this. Maybe this is worth considering, but I know that's not true of most of you. So for about 10% of you, you're like, oh, these are facts. Maybe these facts, maybe this narrative of what could have happened, that's not a hysterically neurotic take on all this. Maybe this is worth considering, but I know that's not true of most of you. But nevertheless, I felt. I mean, I know I'm doing it wrong. This is not how you're supposed to do social media. I'm supposed to jump on here and get you all excited and angry about all the things. I want you to be angry about things for which there is evidence to support a justification for being angry, like these rogue judges. But where there are facts and reason inconsistent with an emotional hot take, I'm afraid that's what you're going to get on this show, is the facts and reason. There's plenty of other places to get the emotional hot take.
Maxwell.
Yeah?
You're home.
Oh, cool. Thanks, Mrs. A.